The golden sun lingered on the horizon, casting long shadows across Fort McDowell, Arizona. As Grace Lawson wiped her brow and stared at the sketch in her hands, a design for a women's riding outfit far more practical than the cumbersome skirts society demanded. Her husband Curtis would be home soon, and with him would come the familiar ridicule that had become as routine as the setting sun. It was 1885, and Fort McDowell was transforming from a military outpost to a growing settlement where traditions ran as deep as the Verde River. At 32, Grace had spent the last decade married to a man who had once promised to cherish her dreams, but now seemed determined to extinguish them, still wasting time on those foolish drawings. Curtis Lawson's voice cut through the peaceful evening air as he entered their modest home, tossing his hat onto the table. His once handsome face had hardened over the years, weathered by the Arizona sun and his own bitterness. Grace quickly tucked the sketches into her apron pocket. "They're not foolish, Curtis. Women need proper riding clothes. Not every lady wants to ride side saddle." Curtis snorted, pouring himself a glass of whiskey. "No decent woman rides astride, and no decent wife wastes time on such nonsense when there's a house to tend." He gestured around their small but tidy home. "Besides, who would make these contraptions of yours? You can barely keep up with mending my shirts." "I'm a fine seamstress, and you know it," Grace replied, her voice steady despite the familiar ache in her chest. "Mrs. Holbrook said my alterations to her Sunday dress were better than anything she'd seen in Phoenix." "Alterations aren't the same as creating something from scratch," Curtis said dismissively. "And no woman in this town would be caught dead in trousers. It's indecent." Grace bit her tongue, knowing from experience that arguing further would only fuel his mockery. She had once believed her husband would support her ambitions. When they'd married in Missouri and decided to head west, he'd spoken of opportunities and new beginnings. Somewhere along the journey, those promises had turned to dust. "I'm going to check on the horses," Grace said, needing to escape the suffocating atmosphere. Curtis merely grunted, already more interested in his whiskey than his wife. Outside, the evening air brought little relief from the day's heat. Grace made her way to the small stable behind their house, where their two horses stood in companionable silence. Pepper, her mare, nickered softly as Grace approached. "At least you believe in me, girl," Grace murmured, stroking the horse's velvet nose. She pulled out her sketches again, studying the practical design she'd created: split skirts that would allow a woman to ride properly while maintaining modesty. She'd even worked out a special fold that would make the garment appear as a regular skirt when standing. "Those are mighty interesting drawings." The deep voice startled Grace, and she whirled around to find a tall stranger leaning against the stable door. He pushed himself upright, tipping his hat apologetically. "Didn't mean to frighten you, madam. Name's Caleb Norwood. Just bought the Collins place down the road." Grace hastily tucked away her sketches again. "Grace Lawson. Welcome to Fort McDowell, Mr. Norwood." Caleb stepped forward, and in the fading light, Grace could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 35 or so. His face was tanned from the sun, with laugh lines around his eyes that suggested a kinder disposition than most men who came through these parts. "Are those riding outfits?" he asked, nodding toward her pocket where the corner of a sketch peeked out. Grace hesitated, then slowly withdrew the papers. "Yes, for women, so they can ride properly without all the complications." To her surprise, Caleb didn't laugh. Instead, he took the sketches when she hesitantly offered them, studying them with genuine interest. "My sister would have loved these," he said finally, handing them back. "She always complained about riding side saddle. Said it was a good way to break your neck for no reason other than men's sensibilities." Your sister sounds like a sensible woman, Grace replied, unable to hide her smile. She was, Caleb said, a shadow crossing his face. Lost her 2 years back. Horse spooked while she was riding side saddle. Couldn't get free in time. I'm so sorry, Grace said, feeling the weight of his loss. Caleb nodded, then gestured to the sketches. You planning to make these? Before Grace could answer, Curtis's voice rang out from the house, calling her name with impatience clear in his tone. I should go, she said, tucking the sketches away once more. It was nice meeting you, Mr. Norwood. Likewise, Mrs. Lawson. Caleb tipped his hat again. And for what it's worth, I think your designs could save lives. As Grace hurried back to the house, his words echoed in her mind, feeding a spark of hope she'd thought all but extinguished. The following day, Grace found herself at Harriet Thompson's general store, the only place in Fort McDowell where one could purchase fabric and sewing supplies. The bell above the door jingled as she entered, and Harriet looked up from where she was arranging a display of canned goods. Grace Lawson. Just the woman I wanted to see, Harriet said warmly. At 55, she was one of the town's original settlers and had a no-nonsense approach to life that Grace admired. I've got that navy blue thread you were looking for last week. Thank you, Harriet, Grace said, making her way to the fabric section. She ran her fingers over a bolt of sturdy cotton twill, mentally calculating how much she would need for a prototype of her riding outfit. Making something special? Harriet asked, coming to stand beside her. Grace hesitated. I'm experimenting with a new design. Well, that twill would stand up to just about anything. It's what the men use for work pants, Harriet remarked. Need any help carrying it home? I could have my boy deliver it. That would be wonderful, Grace admitted. I'd like 3 yards, please. As Harriet measured and cut the fabric, the bell above the door jingled again. Grace turned to see Caleb Norwood stepping inside, ducking his head slightly to avoid the low door frame. Good morning, ladies, he said, tipping his hat. Mrs. Thompson, I'm in need of some supplies for my new place. Mr. Norwood, welcome, Harriet said, clearly pleased to have a new customer. I'll be with you in just a moment. Let me finish with Mrs. Lawson here. Caleb nodded, then spotted Grace. Mrs. Lawson, good to see you again. Mr. Norwood, Grace acknowledged, feeling strangely flustered under his direct gaze. You two already acquainted? Harriet asked, her keen eyes missing nothing. We met briefly yesterday, Grace explained. Mr. Norwood has bought the old Collins place. About time someone took that property, Harriet said approvingly. Been sitting empty too long. You planning to raise cattle, Mr. Norwood? Some, Caleb replied. But my main interest is horses. I breed and train them, hoping to establish a decent operation here. A horse breeder. Grace couldn't help her interest. What kind? All kinds, depending on what folks need, he said. But I've got a special touch with the difficult ones, horses that other folks have given up on. Harriet wrapped Grace's fabric in brown paper. Sounds like you two have a common interest. Grace here is the best horsewoman in the county, though her husband doesn't like to admit it. Grace felt her cheeks warm. Harriet exaggerates. I do nothing of the sort, Harriet countered. Remember when Doc Wilson's stallion wouldn't let anyone near after that rattlesnake incident? You were the only one who could calm him down. Caleb looked at Grace with newfound respect. Is that so? I'd love to see you work with horses sometime. The door jingled again, and Grace's stomach dropped as Curtis walked in. His eyes narrowed as he took in the scene. Grace, he said tightly. I thought you were just getting thread. Grace quickly gathered her package. I found some fabric I needed as well. Curtis, this is Mr. Norwood. He's bought the Collins place. Curtis gave Caleb a cursory nod. Lawson. Curtis Lawson. Pleasure, Caleb said, extending his hand, which Curtis shook briefly. "We should be going," Curtis said to Grace, not bothering to hide his impatience. "Pastor Wilson's wife is ill and I told him you'd bring over a meal." "Of course," Grace said. She turned to Harriet. "Could you have the fabric delivered later today? Consider it done," Harriet assured her. As they left the store, Curtis gripped Grace's arm a bit too tightly. "I don't like the way that Cowboy was looking at you." "He wasn't looking at me any particular way," Grace protested. "We were just talking about horses." "HMPH," Curtis grunted. "Just remember you're a married woman, and what's this about fabric? What are you planning now?" Grace thought quickly. "Mrs. Henderson asked me to make a dress for her daughter's birthday. The fabric is for that." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, but she knew the truth would only lead to another round of mockery and forbiddance. As they walked home in tense silence, Grace couldn't help but think about Caleb Norwood and his interest in her designs. For the first time in years, someone had looked at her ideas and seen potential instead of foolishness. Over the next 2 weeks, Grace worked on her riding outfit in secret. She used the hours when Curtis was away at his job at the bank to cut and sew the sturdy twill fabric. The design evolved as she worked split skirts that looked like a regular skirt when standing still, but allowed freedom of movement when on horseback. She added practical touches: deep pockets for carrying small items, reinforced seams for durability, and adjustable waistbands for comfort. One afternoon, as she was hurriedly putting away her work before Curtis was due home, there was a knock at the door. Grace opened it to find Caleb Norwood standing there, hat in hand. "Mr. Norwood," she said, surprised. "What brings you by, Mrs. Lawson?" he replied, his expression serious. "I've got a situation with a horse that I thought you might be able to help with, given what Mrs. Thompson said about your way with difficult animals." Grace hesitated. "I'm not sure my husband would approve." "It's a mare," Caleb explained. "Brought her with me from Colorado. She's always been high-strung, but since the journey she won't let anyone near her. She's not eating properly and I'm concerned." The worry in his eyes was genuine, and Grace couldn't bring herself to refuse. "Let me leave a note for my husband. I can spare an hour." She quickly scribbled a message saying she was helping Mrs. Thompson with an emergency at the store, then grabbed her shawl and followed Caleb to where his horse waited. "We'll have to ride double," he said apologetically. "I didn't bring a second mount." Grace nodded, suddenly nervous at the prospect of such close proximity. Caleb mounted first, then offered his hand to help her up behind him. She settled onto the horse's back, awkwardly arranging her skirts. "This is exactly why women need better riding clothes," she muttered. Caleb chuckled. "How's that project coming along?" "Slowly," Grace admitted. "But I'm making progress." The ride to Caleb's ranch took about 20 minutes, during which Grace became increasingly aware of the solid warmth of him in front of her. It had been years since she'd experienced such proximity to a man who wasn't her husband, and longer still since such closeness had made her pulse quicken. Caleb's property was larger than she'd expected, a sprawling ranch with a newly painted barn and corrals for the horses. Several animals grazed in a large pasture while others occupied individual paddocks. "This is impressive," Grace said as he helped her dismount. "You've done a lot of work in a short time." "Had some help," Caleb admitted. "Hired a few local men who needed the work. The problem case is over here." He led her to a separate corral where a beautiful Palomino mare stood alone, her head low and her stance wary. "That's Sunflower," Caleb said softly. "Used to be the gentlest horse you'd ever meet. Something happened on the journey here. She was in a boxcar that got jolted pretty badly during a stop. Ever since, she's been like this." Grace studied the mare thoughtfully. "She's frightened, not mean." "That's my assessment too, but I can't get close enough to help her." "Let me try," Grace said, removing her shawl and rolling up her sleeves. She approached the corral slowly, making sure Sunflower could see her clearly. For the next hour, Grace worked patiently with the traumatized mare, speaking softly and moving with deliberate calm. She didn't attempt to touch Sunflower, just established her presence as non-threatening. Eventually, the horse's posture relaxed slightly, and she took a tentative step toward Grace. "Well, I'll be," Caleb murmured from where he watched. "She hasn't voluntarily approached anyone since the accident." "She needs time and consistency," Grace said. "I could come back tomorrow, work with her some more." "I'd appreciate that," Caleb said. "Though I don't want to cause trouble with your husband." Grace's smile faded. "I'll think of something to tell him." As they prepared to leave, Caleb hesitated. "Mrs. Lawson, Grace, can I ask you something?" She nodded, curious. "Why does a woman with your talents and spirit allow her husband to mock her dreams?" The directness of the question took her breath away. No one had ever addressed the situation so bluntly before. Most people in town knew that Curtis could be difficult, but they looked the other way, as was the custom with marital matters. "Marriage isn't always what one expects," she finally said. "And options for women are limited, especially out here." Caleb studied her face. "I think you're stronger than you give yourself credit for." Before she could respond, they heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Grace's heart sank as Curtis rode into view, his face a thundercloud. "Mrs. Thompson said she hadn't seen you all day," he said coldly, dismounting and striding toward them. "What exactly is going on here?" "Mr. Norwood needed help with an injured horse," Grace explained quickly. "I have experience, you have responsibilities at home," Curtis cut her off. "Not gallivanting around with strangers." "Now, hold on," Caleb stepped forward. "Your wife was doing me a kindness. The fault is mine for asking." Curtis turned his anger toward Caleb. "Stay away from my wife, Norwood. We don't need your kind causing trouble here." "And what kind would that be?" Caleb asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Grace moved between them. "Please, let's not do this. Curtis, I'm sorry I wasn't truthful about where I was going. It won't happen again." Curtis grabbed her arm. "Damn right it won't. We're leaving." As Curtis practically dragged her to his horse, Grace looked back at Caleb, who stood watching with a mixture of anger and concern. She gave him a small nod to indicate she would be all right, then allowed Curtis to help her mount. The ride home was silent and tense. Once inside their house, Curtis finally spoke. "If you ever embarrass me like that again—" "I didn't embarrass you," Grace interrupted, finding courage she didn't know she possessed. "I helped someone in need. There was nothing improper about it." Curtis laughed harshly. "Nothing improper. The whole town will be talking about how my wife was alone with that cowboy on his property." "Then let them talk," Grace said, straightening her spine. "I did nothing wrong." Curtis stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. "What's gotten into you?" "Ever since that man came to town, you've been different." "Maybe I'm just tired of hiding who I am," Grace said quietly. "Tired of having my ideas mocked and my abilities questioned." Curtis's expression hardened. "This isn't about your ridiculous designs again, is it? Did you show them to him? Did he fill your head with false hopes?" "They're not ridiculous," Grace insisted. "And yes, Mr. Norwood thinks they have merit." "Of course he does," Curtis sneered. "He'll say anything to win your favor." "Not everyone is as dismissive as you," Grace said, hurt and anger making her bold. "Some people can recognize a good idea when they see it." Curtis shook his head. "You live in a fantasy world, Grace. Always have. It was charming when you were 20, but you're a grown woman now. It's time to accept your place." "And what place is that exactly?" Grace asked, her voice trembling. "As my wife, managing our home, not chasing foolish dreams that will never amount to anything." The words stung, as they always did, but this time Grace didn't retreat into silence. "Those foolish dreams could help women, Curtis." They could make riding safer and more comfortable. Why can't you see that? Because it's not your place to change how things are, Curtis replied, his tone suggesting the matter was closed. Now, I expect dinner to be ready at the usual time. I have a meeting at the bank this evening. He left the room and Grace stood alone in the kitchen, her hands clenched into fists. For years, she had accepted his dismissal of her ideas, had buried her ambitions under the weight of his expectations. But something had changed. Maybe it was Caleb Norwood's belief in her designs, or maybe it was simply that she had finally reached her limit. Either way, Grace knew she couldn't continue like this. She needed to find a way to pursue her dream, with or without her husband's approval. The next morning, Curtis left early for work without saying goodbye. Grace waited until he was well away before retrieving her nearly completed riding outfit from its hiding place beneath a loose floorboard in their bedroom. The garment was almost finished, she just needed to add the final touches to the waistband and hem. As she worked, her mind drifted to Sunflower. The mare had made a small breakthrough yesterday, but she needed consistent interaction to fully recover from her trauma. Grace found herself wishing she could return to Caleb's ranch to continue working with the horse, despite Curtis's prohibition. A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. She quickly hid the garment and went to answer it, surprised to find Harriet Thompson standing on her doorstep. "Harriet, is everything all right?" The older woman gave her a sympathetic smile. "That depends on your definition of all right. May I come in?" Grace stepped aside to let her enter, suddenly anxious. "Would you like some tea?" "No, thank you, dear. I can't stay long." Harriet settled into a chair at the kitchen table. "I wanted to check on you. Word travels fast in a small town, and I heard about what happened yesterday." Grace sighed. "Curtis was upset that I went to Mr. Norwood's ranch." "As husbands often are when their wives show independence," Harriet said dryly. "But that's not why I'm here. I came because I have a business proposition for you." Grace blinked in surprise. "A business proposition, indeed." Harriet leaned forward. "I've been watching you for years, Grace Lawson. You have talent with a needle that's being wasted on mending shirts and darning socks. And these designs of yours for women's riding clothes, they have potential." "How did you know about those?" Grace asked, startled. Harriet smiled. "Mr. Norwood mentioned them when he came by the store this morning. He also mentioned that your husband doesn't appreciate your creativity." Grace felt her cheeks warm. "Curtis is traditional in his views." "Traditional is one word for it," Harriet sniffed. "Short-sighted is another." "But here's my proposition. I want to sell your designs in my store." Grace stared at her. "You can't be serious." "I'm always serious about business opportunities," Harriet replied. "Women in this territory need practical clothing. The few options that exist are either poorly made or prohibitively expensive. With your designs and sewing skills, we could offer something truly useful." Hope blossomed in Grace's chest, quickly followed by doubt. Curtis would never allow it. "What Curtis doesn't know won't hurt him," Harriet said pragmatically. "You could work on the garments here during the day. I'd handle the selling and take a small commission. The rest of the profits would be yours." "It's tempting," Grace admitted, "but if Curtis found out—" "That's a bridge we'll cross if we come to it," Harriet said. "Think about it, Grace. This could be your chance to make something of your dreams." After Harriet left, Grace sat for a long time at the kitchen table, turning the proposition over in her mind. It was risky. Curtis would be furious if he discovered she was selling her designs. But the thought of seeing her ideas become reality, of helping other women, was too compelling to dismiss. Decision made, she retrieved her riding outfit and finished the final stitches. Tomorrow, she would take it to Harriet to display in the store. It would be the first step toward claiming the dream she had carried for so long. That evening, Curtis returned home in an unexpectedly good mood. "I've been offered a promotion," he announced as he hung his hat by the door. "Senior loan officer. More money, more respect in the community." "That's wonderful," Grace said, genuinely pleased for him despite their ongoing tension. "Congratulations." Curtis smiled, the expression transforming his face to remind her briefly of the man she had married. "I thought we might celebrate. Perhaps dinner at the hotel restaurant on Saturday." "I'd like that," Grace replied, touched by the gesture. His good mood continued through dinner, and for the first time in months they conversed without argument. Grace almost found herself reconsidering her plan to sell her designs behind his back. Perhaps, with this promotion and the happiness it brought him, Curtis might become more open to her ideas. "I've been thinking," she ventured cautiously as they sat by the fire after dinner, "about my designs for women's riding clothes." Curtis's expression immediately cooled. "Grace, not this again. Please just listen," she persisted. "There's a real need for practical women's clothing. It could be a business opportunity." "A business opportunity?" Curtis repeated, incredulity in his tone. "For whom exactly?" "For us," Grace said. "I could make the clothes and we could sell them. With your new position at the bank, you'd have connections to potential customers in other towns." Curtis stared at her for a long moment, then laughed. The sound held no humor. "You can't be serious. My wife going into business making trousers for women. Do you have any idea how that would reflect on me, on my reputation?" "Times are changing," Grace argued. "Women need practical options." "Not in Fort McDowell, they don't," Curtis said firmly. "This conversation is over, Grace. I won't have you embarrassing me with these outlandish ideas." "They're not outlandish," Grace insisted, her earlier hope crumbling. "They're practical and necessary." Curtis stood, his expression hardening. "I said the conversation is over. I've humored your little hobby for years, but it stops now. No more designs, no more talk of women in trousers. Do you understand?" Grace looked up at the man she had once loved, the man whose support she had once counted on, and saw only a stranger. "Yes," she said quietly. "I understand perfectly." The next morning, after Curtis left for work, Grace wrapped her completed riding outfit in brown paper and headed for Harriet's store. Her heart pounded with each step, knowing she was defying her husband's explicit command, but she couldn't turn back now. This wasn't just about a garment, it was about claiming her own worth. Harriet was helping a customer when Grace arrived, so she waited patiently, running her fingers over the paper-wrapped package. When the customer left, Harriet turned to Grace with a knowing smile. "You've decided?" Grace nodded, unwrapping the package to reveal her creation. Harriet examined it carefully, admiring the craftsmanship and the clever design that allowed for both modesty and practicality. "This is excellent work," she said finally. "Better than I expected, and my expectations were already high. I can display it today if you're certain." "I am," Grace said firmly. "Curtis made his feelings very clear last night. He'll never support this, so I need to do it without him." Harriet squeezed her hand. "It takes courage to pursue your dreams in the face of opposition." "I should know my late husband thought a woman had no business running a store. Now look at me." As Harriet arranged the riding outfit on a mannequin in the corner of the store, Grace felt a mixture of pride and apprehension. She had crossed a line today, one that couldn't be uncrossed. Whatever happened next, her life would never be the same. As she left the store, she nearly collided with Caleb Norwood, who was just entering. "Mrs. Lawson," he said, his face lighting up. "I was hoping to see you." "Mr. Norwood," she replied, acutely aware of the curious glances from passers-by. "I'm afraid I can't stay and chat." "My husband, I understand," Caleb interrupted. "But I wanted to apologize for causing trouble between you and your husband. That wasn't my intention." "You have nothing to apologize for," Grace assured him. "How is Sunflower?" "Better, but still wary," Caleb said. "She could use your touch." Grace hesitated. "I don't think I can come back to your ranch. It would cause more problems than I can afford right now." Caleb studied her face. "You've made a decision, haven't you, about your designs?" Grace glanced back at the store where Harriet was now arranging the mannequin in the window. "Yes, I'm going to sell them through Mrs. Thompson's store, against your husband's wishes." "Yes," Grace admitted. "It's wrong, I know, but it's not wrong to pursue your talents," Caleb interrupted. "It's wrong to stifle them." He paused, then added, "If you ever need help or just a place to work undisturbed, my door is open to you." The offer touched her deeply. "Thank you, I should go now." As she walked home, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that she was living between two worlds: the constrained existence she shared with Curtis, and the possibility of something more fulfilling that Caleb and Harriet represented. It was an uncomfortable place to be, but for now, it was the only path forward. Over the next 2 weeks, Grace settled into a new routine. Each morning after Curtis left for the bank, she would work on new riding outfits, carefully hiding her materials whenever she heard approaching footsteps. 3 times a week, she would take her completed work to Harriet's store, where it was displayed discreetly in the women's section. To her surprise and delight, the garments began to sell. First to Mrs. Dr. Wilson, who had always been progressive in her views, then to the young wife of a rancher from outside town, and then to several other women who had long felt the constraints of conventional riding attire. Each sale brought a small payment, which Grace hid in a tin beneath the loose floorboard alongside her designs. The secrecy weighed on her, but the joy of seeing her creations appreciated far outweighed the guilt. For the first time in years, she felt purposeful, her skills acknowledged and valued. The money, while modest, was hers alone, a small taste of independence that grew increasingly precious. One afternoon, as she delivered 2 new outfits to the store, Harriet pulled her aside with excitement in her eyes. "You won't believe this," the older woman said. "I've had an inquiry from a ladies' outfitting store in Prescott. They've heard about your designs and want to place an order for 6 garments," Grace gasped. 6, all at once, with more to follow if they sell well, Harriet confirmed. "This could be the beginning of something bigger, Grace." The prospect was both thrilling and terrifying. A larger order would mean more work, more materials, and greater difficulty hiding her activities from Curtis. "I don't know if I can manage that many without Curtis noticing," she admitted. Harriet considered this. "What if you had a proper workspace, somewhere away from your home?" "I couldn't afford to rent a place," Grace said. "Perhaps you wouldn't have to," Harriet mused. "Let me think on it. In the meantime, shall I accept the order?" Grace took a deep breath. Yes, accept it." As she left the store, buoyed by the news, Grace nearly walked straight into Caleb, who seemed to have a habit of appearing just when she was leaving Harriet's. "We have to stop meeting like this, Mrs. Lawson," he said with a smile that made her heart flutter inappropriately. "People will talk." "They already are," Grace replied ruefully. Indeed, she had noticed the speculative glances and hushed conversations that sometimes fell silent when she approached. In a town the size of Fort McDowell, little remained secret for long. "I heard your riding outfits are selling well," Caleb said, falling into step beside her as she walked. "Congratulations." "Thank you," Grace said, warmed by his genuine enthusiasm for her success. "Though I'd appreciate your discretion, Curtis still doesn't know." Caleb's expression grew serious. "He hasn't noticed the extra money. I've been careful to hide it," Grace explained. "And he rarely pays attention to household matters unless something's amiss." They had reached the edge of town, and Grace knew she should turn toward home, but she was reluctant to end their conversation. "How is Sunflower?" she asked. "Much improved," Caleb said, his face brightening. "I've been using the techniques I observed you using. She lets me approach now, even accepts an apple from my hand." "That's wonderful progress," Grace said sincerely. Caleb hesitated, then asked, "Would you like to see her? I know your husband forbade you from coming to the ranch, but we could meet at the south pasture. It borders the public trail, so there'd be nothing improper about it." Grace knew she should refuse. She was already taking enough risks with her secret business. But the thought of seeing Sunflower again, and if she was honest with herself, spending more time in Caleb's company was too tempting to resist. "Tomorrow afternoon," she decided. "Around 2 o'clock. Caleb's smile was like sunrise. "I'll be there with Sunflower." The next day, Grace made sure her household duties were completed early, then changed into one of her own riding outfits, the first she had kept for herself. The split skirt allowed her to mount her mare properly, and as she rode toward the south pasture, she reveled in the freedom of movement it provided. Caleb was already waiting, Sunflower grazing nearby with a lead rope loosely attached to her halter. The Palomino looked up as Grace approached, ears pricked forward with interest. "She remembers you," Caleb said as Grace dismounted. "Look how alert she is." Grace approached the mare slowly, speaking softly as she had before. Sunflower watched her with intelligent eyes, then stretched her neck forward to sniff Grace's outstretched hand. "Hello, beautiful girl," Grace murmured. "You're looking much better." For the next hour, Grace worked with the horse, gradually reintroducing touch and building trust. By the end of the session, she was able to run her hands along Sunflower's neck and shoulders, an achievement that clearly delighted Caleb. "You have a gift," he said as they watched Sunflower graze peacefully afterward. "A way of connecting that I've rarely seen." "Animals are often easier to understand than people," Grace replied. "They don't hide their feelings or say one thing while meaning another." Caleb studied her face. "Your husband doesn't appreciate you, does he?" The directness of the question startled her. "Curtis has his own ideas about what a wife should be. And you don't fit those ideas," Grace sighed. "I did once, or I tried to, but over the years I've changed, or perhaps I've simply stopped pretending to be someone I'm not." "And who are you, Grace Lawson?" Caleb asked softly. The question hung in the air between them, deceptively simple yet profound. Who was she, beyond her roles as wife and neighbor and now secret businesswoman? "I'm still figuring that out," she admitted. "But I know I want my life to mean something more than keeping a tidy house and serving my husband's needs." Caleb nodded, understanding in his eyes. "For what it's worth, I think you're doing something important. Your designs could change women's lives for the better." "If I can find a way to make them more widely available," Grace said, thinking of the Prescott order. "I need a proper workspace, somewhere I can sew without constantly looking over my shoulder." Caleb was quiet for a moment, then said, "The old foreman's cabin on my property is empty. It's small, but it has good light and a solid roof. You'd be welcome to use it." Grace stared at him, hope and caution warring within her. "That's very generous, but it would be improper for me to work on your property." "Not if you had a chaperone," Caleb pointed out. "Mrs. Thompson could accompany you, or perhaps one of the other ladies who's purchased your designs." The idea took root in Grace's mind, growing more appealing by the moment. A space of her own, away from Curtis's critical eye, where she could create freely. "I'll think about it," she promised, though in her heart she had already decided. As she prepared to leave, Caleb reached out to help her mount, his hand warm on her waist even through the fabric of her riding outfit. The touch was brief and proper, yet it sent a current of awareness through her that was anything but proper. "Thank you for today," she said, looking down at him from horseback. "For everything." "The pleasure was mine," he replied, his eyes holding hers a moment longer than necessary. As Grace rode home, she tried to sort through her jumbled feelings. Gratitude for Caleb's help was appropriate, as was appreciation for his support of her designs. But the flutter in her stomach when he smiled, the warmth that spread through her when their eyes met, those feelings were dangerous for a married woman. Yet she couldn't deny them, any more than she could deny her need to create or her dream of independence. They were all part of the person she was becoming, the self she was discovering after years of suppression. When she arrived home, Grace was surprised to find Curtis already there, sitting at the kitchen table with a strange expression on his face. Before him lay one of her riding outfits, a newly completed design she had planned to deliver to Harriet the next day. "Curtis," she gasped, her heart dropping. "I can explain, can you?" he asked, his voice unnaturally calm. "Can you explain why my wife has been lying to me? Why Mrs. Henderson thanked me today for your wonderful design that allows her daughter to ride properly for the first time?" Grace swallowed hard. "I wanted to tell you, but you made it clear you didn't support my ideas." "So you went behind my back," Curtis said flatly. "Made me look like a fool in front of the whole town." "That wasn't my intention," Grace insisted. "I just wanted to what? Defy me. Embarrass me." Curtis stood, his face flushing with anger. "Do you have any idea what this could do to my position at the bank?" The senior loan officer's wife, selling indecent clothing to respectable women. "There's nothing indecent about practical riding clothes," Grace argued, finding courage in her conviction. "And the women who have bought them don't seem to think they are inappropriate." "Because they don't understand what's at stake," Curtis snapped. "A woman's place, the proper order of things, these matter, Grace. They're the foundation of decent society. Or perhaps they're just convenient excuses to keep women limited and controlled." Grace shot back, surprising herself with her boldness. Curtis stared at her as if seeing a stranger. "Who are you? What happened to the woman I married?" "She grew up," Grace said simply. "She discovered she had dreams of her own, talents that deserved to be used. And that cowboy encouraged you, didn't he?" Curtis's voice had turned dangerously soft. "Norwood, I've heard the whispers around town, seen the way he looks at you." Grace felt a flash of fear. "Mr. Norwood has been supportive of my designs, that's all." "Is it?" Curtis demanded. "Then why were you at his property today? Don't bother denying it. Frank Miller saw you riding toward the south pasture where Norwood grazes his horses." Trapped, Grace could only tell the truth. "I was helping with an injured horse. Mr. Norwood values my expertise with animals." Curtis laughed bitterly. "I'm sure that's not all he values." He picked up the riding outfit, examining it with contempt. "How many of these have you sold? And where's the money?" Grace hesitated, then said, "Enough to know there's a market for them. The money is set aside. I thought perhaps we could use it together, start a proper business." "A business?" Curtis repeated incredulously. "My wife in business? What next? Will you want to vote, run for office?" "Would that be so terrible?" Grace asked quietly. "For me to have ambitions beyond this house?" Curtis's expression hardened. "Yes, it would, because it's not how things are meant to be. A wife's duty is to her husband and home, not to selfish pursuits that undermine the very fabric of society." He took a step toward her, the riding outfit clutched in his hand. "This ends now, Grace. No more designs, no more secret business, and absolutely no more meetings with Caleb Norwood. Do you understand me?" Grace stood her ground. "And if I refuse?" Curtis's face twisted with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Then you are not the woman I married, and I will have to reconsider whether this marriage can continue." The threat hung in the air between them, its implications clear. In 1885, A woman with a failed marriage had few options and fewer protections. She would be ostracized, potentially destitute, her reputation in tatters. "I'll give you tonight to think about your priorities," Curtis said, his tone making it clear which choice he expected her to make. "Tomorrow, we'll discuss how to undo the damage you've caused." He left the house, slamming the door behind him. Grace sank into a chair, trembling with emotion. She had known discovery was inevitable, but she hadn't expected it to come so soon or with such an ultimatum. As the sun set outside her window, Grace faced the most difficult decision of her life. She could acquiesce to Curtis's demands, give up her designs and the independence they represented, and return to being the dutiful wife he expected. Or she could stand by her convictions, pursue her dreams, and face the consequences of defying her husband in a society that rarely sided with rebellious wives. By morning, her path was clear. Grace packed a small bag with essential items: a change of clothes, her sewing kit, her designs, and the money she had earned from her sales. She left a note for Curtis, explaining that she couldn't abandon her dreams or deny her true self any longer. She didn't mention where she was going. It seemed safer that way. As dawn broke over Fort McDowell, Grace slipped out of the house she had shared with Curtis for the last decade, mounted her mare, and rode toward Harriet Thompson's home. The older woman would help her figure out what came next. Harriet answered the door in her nightgown, her eyes widening at the sight of Grace with her packed bag. "Lord have mercy, what's happened?" Grace explained the confrontation with Curtis as Harriet made coffee and urged her to eat something. When she finished her story, Harriet sat back with a thoughtful expression. "So he's given you an ultimatum: give up your designs or give up your marriage." Grace nodded miserably. "I can't go back to living as I was, Harriet, not now that I've tasted independence. But I'm terrified of what comes next." Harriet reached across the table to squeeze her hand. "You're not alone, my dear. There are options." "What options?" Grace asked. "I have some money saved, but not enough to start over somewhere else, and even if I did, a woman traveling alone." "You have friends," Harriet reminded her, "and skills that are valuable. The order from Prescott is just the beginning. If your designs catch on, you could build a real business." "But where would I live? How would I support myself in the meantime?" Harriet smiled. "As it happens, I've been thinking of expanding the store. The room above is just sitting empty, and it could be converted into living quarters. You could stay there while you build your business. In return, you could help in the store when you're not working on your designs." Hope flickered in Grace's heart. "You do that for me," in a heartbeat, Harriet assured her. "Though we should be prepared for Curtis's reaction. He won't take this lying down." As if summoned by her words, a pounding came at the front door. Harriet rose with a sigh. "Speak of the devil." "Wait here." Grace listened anxiously as Harriet answered the door, Curtis's angry voice demanding to know if his wife was there. To her credit, Harriet didn't lie but didn't immediately invite him in either. "Grace is considering her options," Harriet said firmly. "And you would be wise to calm yourself before speaking with her." "I don't need to be calm," Curtis retorted. "I need my wife to come home and stop this nonsense." "That nonsense is her livelihood and passion," Harriet replied. "And until you can respect that, I don't think she's inclined to return." There was a moment of tense silence, then Curtis said, "Let me speak to her, please." The please must have softened Harriet, for she sighed and said, "Very well, but I'm staying right here." Curtis entered the kitchen, his face drawn with a mixture of anger and what might have been concern. He looked at Grace, sitting at the table with her hands wrapped around a coffee mug, and something in his expression shifted. "Grace," he said, his voice gentler than she'd expected. "Come home. We can work this out." "Can we?" she asked quietly. You made it clear last night that you want me to give up my designs, my business. I don't think I can do that, Curtis. You're my wife, he said, as if that explained everything. Your place is with me. As what? Grace challenged. A servant. A decoration. I want to be a partner, Curtis. I want my talents and ideas to be valued, not dismissed. Curtis ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in the gesture. What you're asking goes against everything I believe about marriage, about a woman's proper role. Then perhaps we believe different things, Grace said sadly. And perhaps we can't reconcile those differences. The implication hung in the air between them. Curtis stared at her, then at Harriet, who watched the exchange with vigilant eyes. You've turned her against me, he accused the older woman. No one turned me against you, Grace corrected. Your own actions did that. Your mockery, your dismissal, your refusal to see me as anything more than an extension of yourself. Curtis's face darkened. So that's it. 10 years of marriage, thrown away for some foolish dream of independence. The dream isn't foolish, Grace said. And I'm not throwing our marriage away. I'm asking you to expand your vision of what it could be, to see me as a person with my own ambitions, worthy of support rather than ridicule. For a moment, something like uncertainty flickered across Curtis's face, then his expression hardened once more. If you're not coming home with me now, don't bother coming home at all. I won't be made a laughingstock by a wife who defies me publicly. The words, though expected, still cut deep. Grace took a steadying breath. Then I guess I won't be coming home. Curtis stared at her for a long moment, as if waiting for her to recant. When she didn't, he turned on his heel and left, the door closing firmly behind him. Harriet moved to Grace's side, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. You did what you had to do. He gave you no choice. Didn't he? Grace whispered, tears finally spilling over. I could have given up my designs, gone back to being the wife he wanted. And slowly died inside, Harriet said bluntly. I've seen it happen to too many women. You deserve better, Grace. And now you have the chance to build it. Over the next week, Grace settled into the room above Harriet's store. It was small but comfortable, with a window that provided excellent light for sewing. Curtis made no further attempts to contact her, though she heard through town gossip that he was telling anyone who would listen that she had abandoned him for unnatural pursuits. The whispers and sidelong glances hurt, but Grace found unexpected support among the women of Fort McDowell. Those who had purchased her riding outfits defended her designs and her right to create them. Others, inspired by her courage, began to express interest in her work. Most surprising was the support from some of the men. Doc Wilson, whose wife had been one of Grace's first customers, stopped by the store to tell her that his wife had never been happier or safer on horseback. Even Pastor Jenkins, while cautious about directly contradicting the sanctity of marriage, mentioned in his Sunday sermon the importance of husbands and wives supporting each other's God-given talents. Grace threw herself into completing the Prescott order, grateful for the distraction of work. She had just finished the third outfit when Caleb Norwood appeared at the store one afternoon, his expression grave. Mrs. Lawson, he said formally, conscious of Harriet's presence nearby. Might I have a word? Harriet nodded her approval, and Grace led Caleb to a quiet corner of the store. Is something wrong? I heard about what happened with your husband, Caleb said. I'm sorry. I feel partly responsible if I hadn't encouraged your designs or invited you to help with Sunflower. None of this is your fault, Grace assured him. Curtis and I have been growing apart for years. My designs just brought our differences into the open. Caleb studied her face. Are you all right? Truly, the concern in his voice touched her deeply. I'm adjusting. It's not easy, but I believe I made the right choice. For what it's worth, I think you did too, Caleb said. And my offer still stands. The foreman's cabin is yours to use as a workshop if you want it. Grace hesitated. That's very kind, but given the circumstances and the gossip already circulating. I understand, Caleb said quickly. It was just a thought. But if you change your mind, or if there's anything else I can do to help. Actually, Grace said, struck by a sudden idea, there might be. The store in Prescott that ordered my riding outfits, they might be interested in more if these sell well. But I'd need a way to deliver them and perhaps discuss further business. Say no more, Caleb offered with a smile. I make regular trips to Prescott for supplies. I'd be happy to transport your goods and even represent your interests if you'd like. That would be wonderful, Grace said, relief washing over her. Thank you, Caleb. It was the first time she had used his given name, and the significance wasn't lost on either of them. A subtle shift had occurred in their relationship, not improper, but certainly less formal than before. As spring turned to summer, Grace's business continued to grow. The Prescott store sold out of her initial shipment within 2 weeks and immediately placed a larger order. Word spread to Phoenix, and soon Grace was receiving inquiries from as far away as Tucson and even Santa Fe. Harriet helped her manage the correspondence and finances, while Caleb faithfully transported her goods to distant customers. Between the three of them, they established a small but thriving enterprise, with Grace as the creative force at its center. The work was demanding but deeply satisfying. For the first time in her adult life, Grace was using her talents to their fullest extent, seeing her ideas take shape and make a difference in women's lives. The financial independence was equally liberating. She no longer had to ask anyone's permission to buy materials or invest in better equipment. Curtis, meanwhile, maintained a cold distance. They occasionally passed each other on the street, where he would acknowledge her with a curt nod at best. Grace heard through town gossip that he had begun courting the banker's daughter, a young woman barely 20 who was reportedly everything Grace had failed to be: demure, agreeable, and without ambition, beyond being a good wife. The news stung more than she had expected. Despite everything, a part of her had hoped Curtis might eventually come to respect her choices, even if he couldn't fully embrace them. His quick replacement of her confirmed what she had long suspected: he had loved the idea of a wife, not the actual woman she was. One sweltering July afternoon, as Grace was completing a special order for a rancher's wife in Phoenix, Caleb arrived at the store looking uncharacteristically troubled. "What's wrong?" Grace asked as soon as they had a moment of privacy. "Curtis has been talking," Caleb said grimly. "Not just about you, but about me as well. He's telling people I lured you away from him, that we've been—" He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "That we've been intimate," Grace finished for him, heat rising to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the summer temperature. Caleb nodded. "It's affecting my business. Some folks are hesitant to bring their horses to a man they believe has no honor." "That's ridiculous," Grace said angrily. "We've done nothing wrong." "You and I know that," Caleb agreed, "but perception matters in a small town." Grace felt a surge of guilt. "This is my fault. If I hadn't involved you in my business—" "Stop," Caleb interrupted. "I chose to help you because I believe in what you're doing. I don't regret that for a moment." Their eyes met, and in that instant, Grace confronted a truth she had been avoiding for months. Her feelings for Caleb had grown far beyond friendship or business partnership. In his steady support and unwavering belief in her abilities, he had become essential to her in a way Curtis had never been. But they were both trapped by circumstances. She was still legally married, and he was already suffering from association with her. Any acknowledgement of deeper feelings would only fuel Curtis's accusations and potentially destroy both their reputations beyond repair. "What should we do?" she asked softly, Caleb sighed. For now, perhaps we should be more careful about our interactions. Conduct business by letter when possible, meet only in public places with others present. The suggestion was sensible but painful. Grace had come to treasure their conversations, the easy understanding between them. The thought of deliberately distancing herself from Caleb felt like another loss on top of everything else she had sacrificed. "Is that really necessary?" she asked, unable to keep the disappointment from her voice. Caleb's expression softened. "No, it probably isn't. The damage is already done, and those inclined to believe the worst will do so regardless of our behavior." He hesitated, then added, "Besides, I'm not sure I could stay away even if I tried." The admission hung in the air between them, neither quite ready to address its implications. Instead, Grace said, "Perhaps there's another solution, something that would silence the gossip once and for all." "What did you have in mind?" "A divorce," Grace said, the word still strange on her tongue. Though legally possible in Arizona territory, divorce remained scandalous, especially when initiated by a woman. "If I were no longer married to Curtis, there would be nothing improper about our business partnership." Caleb considered this. It would be difficult. The courts generally favor husbands and Curtis has connections through the bank. "But not impossible," Grace persisted. "Especially if I could prove he abandoned the marriage, not the other way around. It would be a fight," Caleb warned. "Are you prepared for that?" Grace straightened her spine. "I've been fighting for my dreams for years. This would just be one more battle." The look Caleb gave her then was filled with such admiration that it took her breath away. "Then you have my full support, whatever you decide." As summer faded into autumn, Grace consulted with a lawyer in Prescott who specialized in divorce cases. The process, he warned, would be lengthy and potentially ugly. Curtis would fight it, and given the conservative nature of the courts, Grace's abandonment of the marital home would count against her. Still, she was determined to proceed. Freedom from Curtis would mean the ability to fully own her business, to make decisions without the shadow of his disapproval hanging over her. It would also mean the possibility of a future with someone who valued her for exactly who she was, though she tried not to dwell too much on that particular hope. The divorce petition was filed in October 1885. As predicted, Curtis contested it vigorously, portraying himself as the wronged husband whose wife had been seduced away by ambition and the attention of another man. Grace's lawyer advised her to focus on Curtis's emotional abandonment, his mockery of her ideas, his refusal to support her talents, his ultimatum that she choose between her designs and her marriage. The case dragged on into winter, becoming the primary topic of gossip in Fort McDowell. Some sided firmly with Curtis, viewing Grace as a cautionary tale of what happened when women stepped outside their proper sphere. Others, particularly the growing number of women who wore her riding outfits, defended her right to use her God-given talents. Throughout the ordeal, Caleb remained steadfast in his support, though they were careful to maintain a respectful distance in public. Their business dealings continued, conducted with proper formality when others were present. In private, their friendship deepened, though both were careful not to cross the line into anything that could be construed as improper, while Grace's divorce remained unresolved. In January 1886, as a rare snowfall blanketed Fort McDowell, the judge finally rendered his decision. To Grace's surprise and relief, he granted the divorce, citing irreconcilable differences in the expectations of marriage. Curtis was ordered to return Grace's personal property, while she relinquished any claim to their house or his bank accounts. "It's done," Grace said wonderingly, staring at the official papers her lawyer had delivered. She sat in Harriet's kitchen, the older woman across from her with tears of joy in her eyes. "I'm free." "You've been free in spirit for some time," Harriet observed. "Now the law recognizes what we've all seen." Grace smiled, though a tinge of sadness remained. Despite everything, ending a 10-year marriage was not without grief for what might have been, for the young couple who had once dreamed of building a life together. "What will you do now?" Harriet asked. "Continue building my business," Grace replied. "The orders keep coming in, and I'm thinking of expanding beyond riding outfits to other practical women's clothing." "And Caleb?" Harriet asked gently. Grace felt her cheeks warm. "What about him?" Harriet gave her a knowing look. "Don't play coy with me, Grace Lawson. That man has been in love with you since he first saw your designs. The only thing holding him back was your married state." "It's too soon," Grace protested. "The divorce is barely finalized. People would talk." "People always talk," Harriet said dismissively. "The question is whether you'll let their opinions dictate your happiness." The snow continued to fall outside the window as Grace considered Harriet's words. She had already defied convention in pursuing her designs and seeking her divorce. Why stop now, when the prospect of genuine happiness with a man who truly respected her was within reach? 2 days later, Grace rode to Caleb's ranch, her heart pounding with nerves and anticipation. She found him in the barn grooming Sunflower, who had become a magnificent specimen under his care. "Grace," he said, surprised and pleased by her unexpected visit, "is everything all right?" "Yes," she said, suddenly shy. "I wanted to tell you that the divorce is final. I'm officially Grace Lawson again, not Mrs. Curtis Lawson." Caleb set down the brush and stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "That's wonderful news. How do you feel?" "Relieved," she admitted. "And a little scared, but mostly hopeful." "Hopeful," he repeated, a question in his voice. Grace took a deep breath. "Yes, hopeful about the future. About possibilities that weren't open to me before." Understanding dawned in Caleb's eyes, along with a warmth that made her breath catch. "Grace," he said softly, "I've respected the boundaries between us because it was the right thing to do. But now those boundaries no longer exist," she finished for him. "At least not legally." Caleb closed the distance between them, taking her hands in his. "I've admired you from the moment I saw your designs. Your talent, your determination, your courage, they're extraordinary. But as I've come to know you, that admiration has grown into something much deeper." Grace's heart soared at his words. "I feel the same way. You believed in me when no one else did, supported my dreams without trying to control them. That means more to me than I can express." Caleb's smile was radiant. "Does this mean you might consider a courtship? I know it's soon after your divorce and people will talk, but let them talk," Grace said boldly, echoing Harriet's sentiment. "I've spent too many years worrying about what others think. What matters is what feels right to us." Caleb lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Nothing has ever felt more right to me than this." Spring came early that year, bringing with it new beginnings. Grace's business continued to flourish, with orders now coming from as far away as Denver and San Francisco. She hired 2 young women from town as apprentices, teaching them not just sewing skills but the business aspects as well. Her courtship with Caleb progressed with a natural ease that surprised them both. Unlike her relationship with Curtis, which had always felt like she was trying to fit herself into a predetermined mold, with Caleb, she could simply be herself. He delighted in her creativity, sought her opinion on his horse breeding enterprise, and treated her as a true partner. By April, they were discussing marriage. Some in town thought it scandalously quick after her divorce, but many others, especially those who had witnessed Curtis's treatment of Grace over the years, were supportive. Are you sure you're ready for this step? Caleb asked one evening as they sat on the porch of his ranch house, watching the sunset paint the desert in gold and crimson. After everything with Curtis, I'd understand if you wanted to maintain your independence longer. Grace considered his question thoughtfully. Marriage to Curtis made me feel trapped because he saw my dreams as a threat to his authority. Marriage to you would be different because you see my dreams as something to be celebrated and supported. She took his hand, squeezing it gently. I don't see it as giving up my independence, but as joining my life to someone who values all of me. Caleb's eyes shone with emotion. I do value all of you, Grace. Your talents, your determination, your kind heart, everything that makes you the remarkable woman you are. Then yes, she said simply. I'm ready for this step, more than ready. They were married in May 1886 in a small ceremony in Harriet Thompson's garden. Pastor Jenkins officiated, his initial reservations about remarriage after divorce softened by the obvious love between the couple. Grace wore a dress of her own design, practical yet beautiful, like the woman herself. Curtis did not attend, having moved to Phoenix shortly after the divorce was finalized. Grace heard he had indeed married the banker's daughter and seemed content in a relationship where his authority went unchallenged. As for Grace and Caleb, they built a life that balanced their individual pursuits with their shared goals. Grace's riding outfits became famous throughout the Southwest, eventually expanding into a full line of practical women's clothing sold in stores across the territory. Caleb's horse breeding business thrived alongside it, with Sunflower producing several award-winning foals under their care. They added a sewing workshop to the ranch, where Grace and her growing number of employees created garments that allowed women greater freedom of movement and activity. Caleb built her a proper studio with large windows for natural light and ample space for her expanding business. In the spring of 1888, their son Daniel was born, followed 2 years later by their daughter Elizabeth. Unlike many men of his time, Caleb took an active role in raising their children, encouraging Grace to continue her work even during the demanding early years of parenthood. Your dreams matter just as much as mine, he would say whenever she expressed guilt about dividing her attention between business and family. Our children benefit from seeing both their parents pursue what they love. By 1895, Lawson riding apparel had become a household name across the Western Territories. Grace had expanded her designs to include practical clothing for women in various professions: nurses, teachers, and even the growing number of female office workers. Each garment reflected her core belief that women deserved clothing that served their needs rather than restricting their movements. On a warm evening in the summer of 1900, Grace and Caleb sat on their porch, watching their children play with the newest foal in the paddock nearby. At 47, Grace's hair was threaded with silver, and lines of laughter marked the corners of her eyes. Caleb, now 50, had the weathered look of a man who spent his days outdoors, but his gaze was as warm and admiring as ever when it rested on his wife. "Do you ever think about how differently our lives might have turned out?" he asked, taking her hand in his. Grace nodded. "Often. If Curtis had supported my dreams instead of mocking them, I might never have found the courage to strike out on my own. I might never have truly discovered what I was capable of. And we might never have found each other," Caleb added. "That would have been the greatest loss of all," Grace said softly. "You didn't just help me build my dreams, Caleb. You helped me build a life where dreams are expected, not exceptional." As the sun set over Fort McDowell, painting the desert in the same golden hues that had illuminated Grace's first sketches all those years ago, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From a wife whose ambitions were dismissed, to a successful businesswoman whose designs had changed countless women's lives. From a marriage of constraint to a partnership of mutual respect and genuine love. Her husband had mocked her dreams, but a cowboy had helped her build them. And in building them together, they had created something far more precious than either could have achieved alone, a life where dreams were not just permitted but celebrated, where love was expressed not through control but through support, and where the journey forward was always undertaken side by side.